Has the public's trust in political language reached an all-time low? Mark Thompson, CEO of the New York Times, has choice words about that in his new book, Enough Said: What's Gone Wrong with Political Language.
This sense of identity and community, a language which is about us, I the speaker, you the audience, and them, our enemies, our rivals, the people who threaten us, felt very alive in the room.
What led an essentially nice young man from a quote-unquote good family to become Stalin's last American spy? Author Kati Martin explores this in her new book, True Believer.
He wanted to do good, but I think if there's a takeaway from True Believer, it is that it isn't enough just to want to do good. You also have to have judgment.
Also, news from the publishing world, and we'll talk about what we and other people are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. The way politicians speak and the way the media both reports and influences political language has changed hugely over the last few decades. My next guest argues that the public is more distrustful of public discourse than ever before. Mark Thompson is the former head of the BBC and the current CEO of the company we both work for, the New York Times. His book is called Enough Said: What's Wrong with the Language of Politics? Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Heather.
You had a long travel from one elevator bank to the other to come down here.
That from the airy upper reaches of the executive C-suite. That's right.
Right. Down to the bowels of the newsroom. First of all, congratulations on the book. I don't know how you found time to write it, but I know that you've been working on this for a long time.
It started in 2012, and I knew I was leaving the BBC after the 2012 Olympic Games in London. Said yes to giving a few lectures at Oxford about this subject and thought it's going to be perfect. I'd promised my wife I was going to spend 6 months or a year quietly at home trying to figure out the next move. Then was asked to and accepted the job of becoming chief executive of the New York Times. And it's been, frankly, a slightly mad enterprise, really. It's sort of 4 o'clock in the morning. You may argue passages of the book read like that as well. But it's been I'm a TV guy. I've got this psychology that once you crack a kind of format, the thing should do itself. And it turns out book writing requires quite a lot of work for every page.
Yes. So is that your routine? Did you wake up and were you like the 4 a.m. to 6 a.m.?
Late nights, early mornings and weekends, yeah.
The lectures that you delivered at Oxford, were those all given in 2012?
Given in 2012. I had a very interesting debate with an old friend that essentially asked me to do them. And he's a modern historian. And his critique of the lectures were, which is, I think a very reasonable critique, is to say, yeah, look, this is all good stuff, but is it really new? To what extent are you talking about something that's really new? And I'd say that my debate with this friend over the last 4 years, I think the argument's been coming slightly my way. I think by the time we get to 2012 and Beppe Grillo and his incredible success in Italy and Brexit and Donald Trump, it's beginning to feel like at least part of what we're seeing, although it's got many echoes in the past, and the book's partly about the echoes from the past, it also does feel, in some important respects, new. So
the book is about essentially the evolution of rhetoric and, to a certain extent, and increasingly the kind of degradation of...
Yeah, it's a sense that the disruption in politics and disruption of media is also tangled up with a kind of disruption in the way we speak publicly to each other and the way in which political language has traded explanation and thoughtfulness for kind of impact.
Even from 2012 until now, a lot has changed because you've had Trump, which you then had to go back and kind of wrestle with in the final editing and writing of the book. And then you had Brexit, of course, and the implications of that. And also when you talk about disruption, you think about technology. And I would think that even between 2012 and 2016, the influence of technology has infiltrated.
I think that's right. Between 2012, I mean, I'll give you an example from politics. I was very struck by, and one of the things that really caused me to say yes to doing the lectures was looking at the way in which healthcare reform was being discussed in America and Britain at the same time. And what interested me was that I felt there were similarities to the way in which the critics of Obamacare in America, principally from the right, the conservatives, Republican critics, and the critics of the attempt to reform the National Health Service in the UK were principally from the left, how similar the tactics were. And I thought that was interesting because it's so easy for us to assume that the fault, the problem is with the other party. Wherever you live in the Western world, it's those guys. It's the
other
it's
side,
the politically correct left, or it's the Tea Party. I begin the book with Sarah Palin's death panels. I think you can draw a kind of genealogical line from the death panels to some of the rhetoric in the present presidential campaign, though it's got much stronger and much more ubiquitous. In terms of technology, I think most of the threads, death panels appeared in 2009 in a Facebook posting and on Twitter. That's how that phrase was one of dozens and dozens of phrases that Sarah Palin was throwing out there, and it was the one that captured the attention. But the ubiquity of social media and the sense of the incredible acceleration of the news cycle. NBC interviewed both Clinton and Trump. During the broadcast, eminent journalists are tweeting that Matt Lauer is doing a bad job of interviewing Trump. This is a bad night for journalism. That's happening in real time while the thing is still going on. And
even something like death panels, which obviously kind of snowballed quickly and got a lot of traction. Now with Twitter, sort of there's a kind of hashtagification of everything, so that you immediately kind of turn it into a sort of jargon or slogan, and then it proliferates.
The would-be debunkers of death panels ended up propagating the phrase themselves. And I think that's very interesting. I think one of the challenges for media is that once we've got to build a wall, folks, we've got to do it. Once a kind of phrase enters the currency, the traditional kind of critiquing which media and journalists do oddly has effect of accelerating and propagating the phrase and the language itself.
Right.
And it's one of the things that no doubt the distinguished journalistic academies of this country are going to do over years is kind of pore over the way in which mainstream media kind of interacted with Donald Trump. I mean, what's the story there, and to what extent did the media do its job, and to what extent did they maybe unwittingly almost accelerate Trump's rise to prominence and so forth?
Do you think that the decline of rhetoric has something to do at all with the fact that we don't really study rhetoric anymore? We don't learn it. You're obviously a well-educated Brit with an Oxford education.
I've got a slightly weird education. As it happens, I had a little bit more rhetoric in my education than most people. Essentially, it was a traditional, in my case, Jesuit classical education, so a little bit more rhetoric than most people. In a weird way, the absolutely Pavlovian assumption that the peak of writing is literature, is poetry, is not the way the Romans thought. The Romans thought that rhetoric was the most distinguished form of, most important form of writing and of speaking that there was. And we lost that. I mean, it's I've got a daughter who's, amongst other things, is a poet, and was taught at Harvard by Jory Graham, the notable American poet. She's the Boylston Professor. But the Boylston Professorship was meant to be a professorship in rhetoric and oratory. John Quincy Adams was the first professor, but even in Victorian times, in the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, Harvard has decided that it's a waste of a perfectly good chair to focus it on rhetoric, and so it's become first a literature chair and then a chair for a living poet. So we've lost it. We absolutely have lost it, and I think I don't talk about this in the book, but I would say at least arguably. Although rhetoric does exist in many American universities and a few British universities, its present focus, it's often called digital humanities now, has come quite a long way from, if you like, the mainstream of the way we think about culture and politics.
I'm going to delete that phrase, digital humanities, from my brain. Thank you. I didn't know it was called that. You mentioned, John Quincy Adams. I think that the president's up to, was it Wilson, who was the last president who wrote his own speeches himself?
I think that's probably true. I mean, I think Ronald Reagan was, as far as we can tell in his early years, really a very good writer of his own material. Obviously,
Peggy Noonan,
Peggy Noonan and others were doing the work when he was president. Though I think, whatever you think of his politics, I think of Reagan as a very, very complete public speaker, able to excel in an incredibly broad register of different tones of voice, humour, high-flown grandiloquence, common man. I think he was wonderful, and I think my sense is that his interaction with his writers was very fruitful and very creative, must have been very fruitful and very creative. It's since then, although there are some very notable public speakers, Clinton and Obama both spring to mind as really exceptional speakers in set-piece speakers, one of the points of the book is I think the public language that people hear most of the time are not the set piece grand moments. They're fragments of language. They're answers in interviews. They are contributions in social media and so forth. So
sound
the other
bites.
Sound bites, yeah.
Most Americans don't even have a tradition, at least, it's been decades of learning rhetoric in school. And so if you would give us a little bit of a rhetoric lesson, you talk and you break it down in your book to ethos and pathos.
Yeah,
and
well, it's not so much me as Aristotle, my very good friend
You're
Aristotle.
You're going to credit him?
Yeah, well, I sort of think, I mean, anyone who wants to understand about rhetoric, Aristotle's art of rhetoric, I mean, essentially 2,500 years ago, he basically nails it. In other words, if you think of Aristotle as an anthropologist who's observing how human beings try and persuade each other of things, his observations 2,500 years ago and the way he kind of codifies his observations, to me at least, still feels very persuasive. And he thinks of, and it's a very profound, like a lot of Aristotle, it's very profound, and often, frankly, it's more profound than more modern theories. He thinks of persuasion as having multiple components. It's a mixture or a combination, or at its best, a happy balance of argument, so evidence-based, rational argument. He uses this word ethos to mean the kind of character and comportment of the speaker, how the speaker comes across, what you know about the speaker, their personality, and pathos or pathos, which is the kind of mood of the audience, the emotional needs, the emotional reactions of the audience. And he thinks of persuasiveness as coming from all three of these things. Mm-hmm. And so he would, I think, sadly he's not here to speak for himself, he would reject a kind of hardline Enlightenment rationalist view that all that really matters is arguments and facts and evidence. He would also, I think, be very suspicious of a rhetoric which was entirely based on character and identity. And you could argue that the rhetoric of Donald Trump falls into the latter category. I
was just going to say, if Aristotle had been to these most recent conventions, political conventions, what would he have thought? What would he have come away with?
In a weird way, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump is almost like a laboratory clash of logos and ethos, and they both rather purely represent the. And I went to the Republican convention. I was very struck by, the extent to which, for his supporters, and not everyone in the convention hall or arena was a supporter, this sense of identity and community, a language which is about us, I the speaker, you the audience, and them, our enemies, our rivals, the people who threaten us, felt very alive in the room. That convention was full of, happened to be on the floor when Ted Cruz was speaking, and the moment when the audience begin to realize at large that he's not going to endorse Trump. There's a point late in Cruz's remarks where it becomes clear he's not going to endorse, and the knife goes in when he says vote your conscience. And this phrase, vote your conscience, is a very interesting, clever use of language. I mean, the records will show that Ted Cruz advised Republicans to vote their conscience. Who could possibly object to that? It was a moment of utter defiance, and it was electric in the room. The next moment, Donald Trump arrives. There was a kind of royal box with the members of the Trump family, and Trump arrives at the back of the royal box. Suddenly, every eye goes to him, and lights go down on stage, and Cruz walks off the stage in darkness. It was a kind of, I think if Aristotle had been at that particular convention, he would have made a few notes, basically.
There's an interesting equivalent across the ocean, of course, in the recent events with Brexit. Yeah. I was at a lunch this week where Lionel Barber from the FT was on a panel with economists about sort of why Brexit turned out the way it did. And he, interestingly, ascribed it to the slogan of the Leave Party, that the idea of take back control, that the success was in those words.
I certainly felt like Lionel that both with take back control and the other slogan was Independence Day, that the day of voting the referendum could be Independence Day for the UK. I thought the Leave campaign were much more effective at finding exactly what my book's about, which are pithy, liberating, empowering slogans, essentially. The other thing about the campaign, and by the way, almost everyone, including in the United Kingdom, for example, the Electoral Reform Society, the Treasury Select Committee, no one thinks that was a good campaign in terms of clarity and explanation. Both sides were guilty of comical exaggeration. I mean, Americans may think of Brits as being kind of stiff upper lip and rather cool, calm and collected. It was an absolutely potty debate. The Remain camp essentially were threatening the 10 plagues of Egypt if Britain left, an instant economic collapse. And are now, by the way, the Remain campaign, the Leave campaign at the moment in the UK are being excoriated for the fact that none of the things they said Brexit was going to deliver apparently are going to be delivered, or at least it's extremely unclear how that's going to happen. But the Remain campaign assured everyone, with, by the way, legions of economists backing them up and the head of the Bank of England, that there will be instant economic disaster. That has also not happened. I mean,
right.
The sun is still rising over Westminster Bridge, and Britain's going about its business. And actually, the August economic numbers look pretty good. There was a kind of very artificial. One of the terrible dangers of the referenda is you don't even have real political parties. You have two imaginary parties, temporary parties,
right.
a Leave party and a Remain party. The day of the vote, the parties vanish. And so there's no one to hold accountable for the decision.
It's sort of this grassroots referendum.
A large group of people who do not feel part of the elite, do not feel they've prospered as a result in the broader sense of the latest chapter of modernity, globalization, the free market. None of those things have really helped them. They worry about their jobs, they worry about their livelihood, and they worry about a way of life which they feel, rightly or wrongly, but they feel is threatened by immigration and by multiculturalism, that the things they believe in and the world that they stand for and their history is at threat.
Right.
And in that case, rather than sort of anti-politics presenting itself with a persona, as with Beppe Grillo in Italy or Donald Trump in America, it presented as an issue. Brexit vote was not really about the European Union. It's about a broader rejection, it seems to me, of much of the modern world and for people who don't feel that it's in their interests.
I feel like we could be talking about America even with just that description. And to get back to the book with one last question, but a big one, how did you grapple with the challenge of writing a book that has its foundations in this Aristotelian approach to rhetoric and go all the way up to Trump and Brexit and sort of what's going on with digital technology? I
apologize in the book for kind of crash landing on so many different kind of disciplines, and I would say that's absolutely the case. What I've hung on to in a way, and one of the threads in the book is essentially my own experience over 30 years of being a journalist, political journalist, an editor, and ultimately a kind of editor-in-chief and all the rest of it as I was at the BBC, observing politics and media and seeing it's changing and scratching my head because I felt that changes were taking place, and in particular adverse changes. And then, if you like, burrowing back into my own education, but also reading and exploring to try and understand. So I think of it as a kind of detective story. I discovered something I don't understand, and which I think is really important, which is the fact that our political language is not tying politicians and political choices and the public together in the way it once did. I'm not suggesting it was ever perfect, but it was better than it is now, and that things are falling apart. And the book is an attempt to explore why by going back in history. And the other thing, which anyone who reads the book will see, is in a way it's a form of literary criticism. In a way, I'm trying to use critical faculties, which I guess I was taught to use to analyse literature, to try and understand what's happening, even to fragmentary language on platforms like Twitter. So that's how it works. All
right, I've got to ask you one last question, which is obviously you were a longtime journalist and then head of the BBC, and now you're here on the business side at the Times. Yeah. What was it like going back into writing and researching and using those muscles? I've always written one way or another and written quite a lot of journalism over the years, even as an executive. And so the writing itself is not an issue. The thing that's felt challenging is cutting a path through such a complicated subject. And a subject, I mean, the really interesting thing about rhetoric is people often think of it as being a throwback and not really mattering and being something which,
yeah, maybe we should worry about, but in practice, there are other more interesting things to look at. I think it turns out, I think the most important message of the book is rhetoric is interesting and important. And it turns out, and I think what I really found exciting about writing the book, it's in the middle of everything. It's in the middle of politics, in the middle of economics, it's in the middle of society. Popular culture influences it. And some of the best and most interesting things written about politics, I think, over centuries, up to and including George Orwell's great essay, Politics in the English Language, they turn out to be really, Orwell doesn't use the word rhetoric once in that essay, but it's a book about rhetoric.
All right. Well put, fittingly. Okay. Mark Thompson, thank you so much. The book, again, is Enough Said, What's Gone Wrong with the Language of Politics by the president and CEO of the New York Times Company, Mark Thompson. Alexandra Alter is here now with some news from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's going on?
So, as you know, this week is the 15th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. And while this anniversary doesn't have the weight of, say, the 10th or the 20th, it's proving to be a significant moment in children's literature. For the first time, we're seeing a real wave of children's fiction, young adult novels, middle grade novels that directly address the September 11th attacks. And while there's been, a handful of books about the subject for kids coming up till now, this is really the first time we're seeing a critical mass of them. And it's an interesting moment because a lot of these readers, of course, have no direct memory of the attacks. And I think that's one of the reasons that authors and publishers feel like it's important to give them literature that can help them sort of understand what the experience was like more than a sort of documentary or nonfiction book can.
Yeah, it's interesting because a bunch of these came out a few years ago. But in that case, it was helping kids understand an experience that they had gone through themselves. And now it's sort of a different purpose because the audience has changed and many of them never went through it.
Exactly. And I think, there have been certainly several novels on the subject for young readers, but publishers and writers both have been very skittish about it for obvious reasons. It's a very traumatic subject, not just for young readers, but for their parents and for teachers. And I think a lot of people thought there wasn't really a market for that kind of a book because parents would be worried about, giving their kids that kind of material. And it just felt a little too fresh still for a lot of people. But then this new fear set in a couple of years ago when some of the young adult writers that I spoke to for this story realized, their own children, their readers of their books had no memory of the events, had no direct kind of experience from it. Meanwhile, the writers felt like their memories were kind of slipping away and becoming less vivid. So they really wanted to get the experiences down.
So are the books coming out picture books? Are they middle grade novels? Are they YA? Are they doing all three? And
it's
what's
a mix.
The age?
I think the bulk of them are middle grade and YA. A couple of the ones that are new that I think are interesting are All We Have Left by Wendy Mills. And I spoke to her for the story, and she had a really interesting kind of origin story for the novel.
Is this for middle grade readers?
This is a young adult novel.
YA, okay.
And it is pretty explicit because, it starts right after the towers fell. The protagonist is a teenage boy whose school was downtown. He flees. He runs across the Brooklyn Bridge. He finds a girl sort of cowering there who has no memory of what happened. His father is a detective, so he's worried he can't reach him. He's worried that he was downtown. That is kind of a more, I guess, emotionally fraught version of some of these. Some of these books are a little milder. So Wendy Mills said she got the idea for the novel when she was going through the airport with her son, Zach, who was 9 at the time, and he asked her why everyone was taking their shoes off. And she told him something vague, like it's to keep us all safe. But that didn't satisfy him, and he kept asking her questions, and finally they got around to the September 11th attacks. And it was such a hard conversation to have, and she realized that he had no context for it, yet his whole world had been shaped kind of by those events, and she realized a lot of her readers were in a similar position, so that's when she started writing this novel. And a couple of the interesting middle grade ones include 9/10 by Nora Raleigh Baskin, which came out in June, and that book takes place it starts 4 days before the attacks, and it follows 4 different young characters, and they're kind of their lives are affected in various ways. One of the girls in the book, her mother has a meeting at the World Trade Center that morning. Another character is a Muslim American girl who wears a hijab, and she feels terrified after the attacks that her family's going to be targeted. So that was an interesting approach. And the characters aren't downtown. It's not as kind of dramatic and vivid and right at the scene. So I think for a younger reader, it's probably easier to process.
Has there been a change in the approach from the sort of first wave of books that came out and now in terms of sort of how they handle the different perspectives on the events? Was the first wave sort of more straightforward, kind of patriotic, this is what happened, and the later wave more sort of nuanced or multi-dimensional in terms of the
that's
viewpoints?
a really great question. I think one thing that you're seeing in the current crop of books that maybe wasn't emphasized in the first few that came out, there's a lot of them have a central character who's Muslim American, and a lot of them deal with fear and discrimination. In All We Have Left by Wendy Mills, one of the characters, Jessie, she's a teenager now in 2016. She's trying to figure out what happened to her brother Travis, who died in the towers. And Jessie's father is deeply anti-Muslim, and that's causing problems for Jessie, and she's picking up some of those ideas. So that is, I think a lot of the writers felt like that there was a real resonance with some of the rhetoric that's happening this year in the political campaigns, fears of immigrants and anti-Muslim sentiment. So they felt like that was an important thing to emphasize. And I imagine that in the first crop of books that came out, or the first handful, that wasn't as much of a theme.
And are schools and librarians embracing these books?
Yes, that's definitely happening. A lot of schools are assigning them or making them available as sort of optional reading, school-wide reads. There's a school in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where the third plane went down. Their entire school is reading the book. And a lot of the teachers
Wendy Mills?
They are reading actually 9-10 by Nora Riley Baskin, because actually one of the storylines in that book takes place in Shanksville, and two of the kids witnessed the plane crash. Teachers are very excited about these books, or the handful of teachers that I spoke to at least are. Some of them are bringing the authors in for either in-person or Skype book discussions, and they feel like it's a really useful tool for them, because when they have to teach this subject, or even if they're not teaching it directly, it comes up on the anniversary, it's a hard thing for them to talk about. They say there's a real disconnect between their memories and these students they're teaching that don't remember anything.
And what have the sales been like on 9/11 books up till now for kids?
So there have been a couple of fairly popular ones, including I Survived 9/11 by Scholastic, which I believe has
part of a series.
It's part of a series about, and they're novels, but they explore different historical disasters. And I Survived 9/11, I think, has close to 2 million copies in print. It did very well. So I think there is an appetite for them. I'm not sure it's going to be like a huge trend. This is not the new vampires or anything like that. But I do think there is, I think teens are curious. I spoke to a couple of young readers for this story, and they had really interesting observations about what they learned from the books that they couldn't really pick up from watching a documentary or from a nonfiction book. One young reader I spoke to said, he just didn't understand how people felt. He didn't understand the level of confusion and fear that everyone in the country felt, not just people who lost family members or loved ones in the attacks, but every single person in every part of the country was, feeling that way. So
the power of children's literature.
Exactly.
All right. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
In the 1930s, Noel Field was a disenchanted State Department employee who thought communism was the answer. He went on to become the most effective Cold War spy you've never heard of, until now. Longtime journalist Kati Martin lays out Field's story in her new book, True Believer, Stalin's Last American Spy, and she joins me now. Kati, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Who was Stalin's last American spy?
An unlikely anti-hero. He was a Harvard grad who was looking to do good things in the world and got talent spotted by Moscow, by the KGB from afar. They were looking for, disenchanted young people. This is the 30s when there were plenty of disenchanted young people because the United States was going through a terrible period of unemployment and to say nothing of racism and all these things which weighed heavily on idealistic young people and made them vulnerable to Moscow's seduction. And he was brilliant. He went through Harvard in 2 years and aced the Foreign Service exam. So he was well positioned for a brilliant career in diplomacy. And all of that did not go unnoticed by the Kremlin and its agents in Washington. And the interesting thing is that we consider witch hunts to be, the fevered imagination of Joe McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover. Well, in the 30s, which is when True Believer takes place, there were plenty of witches in the woods, and Noel Field was one of them. He betrayed his country from his perch in the State Department.
Now, he was born in London, but he...
Yeah, but just that was an accident. The Field family were good New England stock going back to the 17th century.
So this is interesting because, when you think about spies and people who are traitors to their country, you try to figure out, what went wrong and when did it go wrong and how did it go wrong? And Kim Philby is one that obviously we're long fascinated with, and he too came from a good family. What happened with Noel Field? Was he was something wrong from the get-go?
Well, first of all, you raised Kim Philby. I think Noel Field is the closest we have to an American Kim Philby in that he was an American aristocrat. He came from several generations of Harvard graduates, a very good family, in quotation marks, and that proved to be a great shield, as it did for Philby. It was unimaginable that such a, quote, well-brought-up young man, so well-spoken, so articulate, so brilliant, with everything seemingly going for him, would turn on his own country, betray his own country, but really in a violent way, I have to say, because he did whatever was asked of him by Moscow. I mean, he never carried an AK-47 or wore a suicide vest because that wasn't asked of him. But what was asked of him was that he collaborate in the assassination of a fellow, quote-unquote, good communist who saw the light about Stalin, about the fact that Stalin was actually one of the great mass murderers of all time. So Noel Field, had been sufficiently captured by this powerful faith. So as to what went wrong, I would say that he was always kind of alienated from. He was alienated at Harvard. He was a nerdy guy who was always sort of on the margins, and though brilliant, he didn't have terrific social skills, but had a very sharp sensitivity to injustices. I mean, there are many good qualities in this man. It's not a simple bad guy versus the good guys. He wanted to do good, but I think if there's a takeaway from True Believer, it is that it isn't enough just to want to do good. You also have to have judgment, and that Noel Field did not have a lot of, and it led to some terrible outcomes.
I don't want to go through all of the ins and outs of his story, but at a certain point, he is arrested by the Czech.
Well, this is the irony. He was kidnapped by the people that he was serving. That is to say, the Soviets, the KGB. He was looking, kind of like Snowden or even Julian Assange, looking for asylum, one step ahead of an FBI subpoena, and had been lured to Prague, which was then Soviet-controlled, with a fake job offer. And so he went there, and he was nabbed from his hotel in Prague, drugged, and when he regained consciousness, he was in a strange country with people speaking a language he did not understand. That country happened to have been Hungary, and this is where I get lucky.
Right, you have a personal connection here to the story.
Through a bizarre set of circumstances, Noel Field was in the same prison as my parents, who it turns out my parents were journalists, deemed enemies of the state because they were working for the Americans during the Cold War. And it turns out one of the things I uncovered in the KGB archives was a letter from the Hungarian Minister of the Interior saying that the Martons, my parents, were about to interview Noel Field. Noel Field, this is 5 years after the kidnapping, has just been released from prison because Stalin is now dead. And
What year are we now?
We are now in 1955. And it's now Khrushchev who's making nice with Eisenhower, et cetera. And my parents, being the last independent journalists in Hungary, are eager to interview this man. One of the conditions of Noel Field's release from prison was that he never talked to Western media.
This is not quite Western media, I guess.
No. Just as my parents were about to get to him, they arrest my parents. For a period, my father had the same cell as that had just been vacated by Noel Field. And my father was told that by his jailer. And so when my father came out of prison 2 years later, I was a little kid, 6 years old, he told us that he had the, quote, VIP cell vacated by this American agent named Noel Field. And so the first time I ever heard this man's name was back when I was a kid. And then, of course, I completely forgot about it. But during the chaos of the Hungarian Revolution, my parents located Noel Field and his wife and surprised them in their hideaway and did the only existing interview with him. And so I benefit from those notes in True Believer. But I also benefit from the fact that the offspring of the Field family didn't know very much about the whole circumstances of this case. It was all shrouded in mystery, and people didn't talk about it much because it wasn't just Noel Field who was arrested. It was the whole family because his wife went looking for him, then his brother, and then his adopted daughter, and they all vanished. So an entire American family vanished in the height of the Cold War, and what ultimately got them out was that their interrogator, which is a euphemism for torturer, turned up, asked for asylum in Berlin, in West Berlin, then turned up in Washington. The CIA had a big news conference for him, and the interrogator, a Polish agent, said, "The Field family are alive. I know because I was their interrogator." And at that point, Washington starts bombarding Moscow with, release these Americans. The whole family then rush out of the Soviet Union and attempt to rebuild their lives here. Not Noel Field, because he had been unmasked as a spy.
Right.
And so he did not want to face the music here. So he asks for political asylum in the giant prison of the Soviet Union, in Hungary, as it happens, and that's how come my parents, who were Hungarian journalists, got to him.
What inspired you now to go back and revisit this story? And did you have your parents' notes all along, or did you?
Well, what inspired me is that this is a missing chapter from the history of the Cold War. This was an American who was Stalin's chief witness in prosecuting Stalin's enemies, in quotation marks. So this is at the end of Stalin's term. He's paranoid. He wants to eliminate all rivals, and uses this American as the witness against all of them. He has Noel Field tortured into confessing that he's not KGB, but CIA. And therefore, all his friends, all his connections in the communist world, by definition, are guilty by association, are also CIA, and most of them were led to the gallows. So this is, a remarkable thing that an American played that role, and nobody had ever pieced the story together because I got the family to cooperate, and plus I had my own parents' memories and notes, and it was a topic in our household. So, and the other thing that inspired me was the remarkable number of similarities between then and now. The United States that produced this spy was a country that was really having an identity crisis and turning its back on fascism, on the rise of fascism in Europe, which deeply troubled this young man and his cohorts. We were turning our back on Jewish refugees. tightening our quotas against refugees. So parallels abound between then and now.
Did your father talk about his time in the cell and talk about
Yes.
Field?
Yes, he told us he had the same interrogator as Noel Field. And from his interrogator, my father learned the story of how Alger Hiss tried to recruit Noel Field. Now, Alger Hiss, a very well-known American spy, when you read True Believer, you will be absolutely convinced, I think, that Alger Hiss was indeed a spy, an agent.
He was for a different branch of the Soviet intelligence?
Hiss was military, and Noel Field, because of his Quaker origins, couldn't do that.
Interesting. The one allegiance that he...
Right. So he joined the KGB, not much milder.
wouldn't overturn his Quaker principles?
Yes.
Okay. Having looked into the story of this one individual deeply, what did it tell you about our fascination with spies?
Well, I've always been fascinated by spies and the Americans, a show that I'm addicted to. I was very pleased that the guys who write for that show love this book.
Yes, there's a blurb on the book.
Yeah, from the creator.
From Joe Weisberg.
Yes. One of the senior writers, Stephen Schiff, wrote to me saying that he understands so much more now about how it is that spies can live among us, as in the Americans we see them do, the Jennings of Virginia. That was a real boost. And the reason that people like Field got away with what they got away with. I mean, there he was in the State Department and living in Capitol Hill and spying at the same time. And his best shield, like Kim Philby's, was that he didn't look like a spy. Neither does that couple in The Americans.
Right.
They seem so...
They're just like us.
Just like us. That is the best cover.
So much more to talk about in this story, but you'll have to read it in the book, which is True Believer, Stalin's Last American Spy by Kati Martin. Kati, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Pamela, for having me.
If you like hearing from authors and reviewers on the podcast, help us spread the word. Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and rate the show or leave us a comment, preferably favorable. We'd love to hear what you think. Thank you, and let's get back to the show. Greg Coles and John Williams join us now to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
So let's just quickly talk about what the others are reading, and then we'll talk about us.
Sure. All the action this week on the hardcover bestseller list is on the fiction side, where there are 5 new titles. Most notably, probably this debut novel by Nathan Hill called The Nix, N-I-X. It's a debut novel that's gotten a lot of attention in the Times and elsewhere, and it hits the list at number 5, which is very high for a debut literary novel. Also, Louise Penny, A Great Reckoning. That's the latest in her Armand Gamache series. That is new at number 1. And then, Danielle Steele and James Lee Burke and other people who are typically on the list are back on the list.
And there's a couple of new on the nonfiction.
There are a couple. Elizabeth Letts has a book called The Perfect Horse. I actually wrote about this book last week in my column when it was on the extended list, but now it moves into the print edition of the list at number 7.
All due to the attention of your column.
Yeah, no doubt. And then also notably Tom Wolfe with his kind of argument against the theory of evolution and especially the role of evolution in the development of human language. It's a book called The Kingdom of Speech, new at number 14.
Is that a low debut for Tom Wolfe?
It is a low debut, although, it's his first nonfiction book in close to 20 years. And so these days he's really thought of as a fiction writer, and his novels have typically hit the list very high. As a work of nonfiction, it's not what you normally think of from Tom Wolfe. It's not the right stuff. It's not a kind of deep dive work of journalism. It is truly
an argument, a book.
It is truly an argument, yeah. So it's maybe not resonating as much as some of his have.
So let's talk talk about what we are reading. Looks like you've got nothing new there in terms of pub date, John, but new to you.
Well, I often read things that aren't that new in my leisure time, which I had more of this week because I was away for a few days. I read Joan Didion's 1970 novel, Play It As It Lays, which I had never read her fiction before, and I'm a big fan of her nonfiction like most people are. This didn't quite grab me the way that her nonfiction does. It's basically a story about a woman in California who's gone a little mad, and basically the hollowness of the glamorous Hollywood lifestyle. It was made into a movie in 1972, which I didn't know, starring Tuesday Weld and Anthony Perkins. And from what I've seen on YouTube clips, it looks really dreadful. I'm glad I read it, and it definitely has moments, but it wasn't my favorite thing of hers. And now I'm about 100 pages into a book by Dawn Powell called A Time to Be Born. She was the mid-century novelist who was kind of out of print and unknown when she died, and then brought back by this reader named Tim Page, who wrote a biography of her and is kind of the reason why her novels were reissued, and now she kind of has a cult audience. This is a novel that is based on the life of Claire Booth Luce, and it's about a woman from Ohio who comes to New York to sort of ask a favor of an old friend who's become this glamorous wife of a publishing journalist,
I
a
have
publishing
that
star.
2-volume biography of Claire Booth Luce on my to-read list. I'm just dying to read the Sylvia Morris.
Yeah, it's quite a life. When you're done with that, you should read this. It's really good.
All
Dawn
right.
Powell is great.
Those books actually are fairly new in terms of publication date compared to what I'm reading right now.
Don't get competitive.
This is a little bit competitive. I was driven to this book because I mocked John last week for never having read The Great Gatsby before. I was a little bit shocked that he hadn't.
I'm still recovering.
And then it made me realize I have huge gaps in my own reading. And I confessed on social media last year sometime that I had never read anything by Henry James. And when I saw that John was finally reading F. Scott Fitzgerald, it drove me to pick up a book that somebody, I think it might have been the writer and critic Mark Sarvis, when he heard that I hadn't read Henry James, he said, "Oh, you've got to at least read Washington Square." And
yeah,
so
it's
that's
interesting.
the one
Why
that
that one?
Because Mark Sarvis recommended it to me.
It's a little shorter than some of the other ones. So
It is. It's almost novella length. It came out in 1880. It is set in New York, in Washington Square. And it's a book about kind of passion versus duty. It is the heroine of the book, Catherine Sloper, is kind of a plain, undistinguished girl who is finally courted as she reaches adulthood and is proposed to by a man that her very imposing father doesn't approve of. And she needs to decide, between her duty to her father and her chance at love here. I had resisted Henry James for a long time. There was a reason it was a gap in my reading. I thought that I would not love his prose. And it's true, he writes these very kind of sinuous, elegant sentences. He's often held up as an example of just brilliant prose. And he's brilliant at balancing these long sentences. But the real genius of James, as far as I'm concerned, reading this book, is in the psychology and the emotion of it. And he uses the prose to good effect to really get into kind of nuance, psychological nuance. He starts out with these characters being very kind of types, but then he starts to break it down and give you the shades and the complications. And, it's a very enjoyable book and really moves quickly. It's also funnier, more amused than I would have thought. He writes with real affection and kind of a wry keenness for these characters. And what are you reading now, Pamela?
I just finished a book that came out earlier this year, Ian McGuire's book, The North Water, which was reviewed on our cover by Colm Toibin. And
speaking of Henry James.
Yes. And I remember there was a line in Toibin's review that I loved, and I'm going to massacre it here, but it's roughly the book feels like Joseph Conrad and Cormac McCarthy spying each other across an old sort of dirty bar and giving each other a sour nod of recognition. And I'm a total sucker for 19th century stories at sea, because I will never be at sea in the 19th century or probably in this century. So it's a real transportative reading experience for me.
Everything I read about that book made it sound so gory.
It's so incredibly gory.
It's a very grim book. I loved this book, and what I loved most about this book is it automatically forces the characters into a very closed situation. It kind of gives the writer the chance to look at a microcosm of society. It's like a prison novel too.
Yes, and it's a morality tale or an immorality tale, and I can see the comparison to No Country for Old Men, for example, and there's just a really, really good, nasty villain in it. And one of the most interesting things I thought about this villain is that he's a horrible, unredeemable character, and yet he is sort of able to articulate his own code, his own amoral code in a very persuasive way, so that you can kind of, I see why you're a bad guy, and I understand that. So he's not cartoonish.
Is he turning you to the dark side?
No, he won me over. But it is a really brutal, gory book. So unless you have a sort of strong stomach.
It's hard to read a scary book through your fingers the way you might watch a scary movie.
Yes, this book is definitely 18 and up. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.